Hello, I'm Tiffany Payton, and I'm joined now by Dr. Leonard Jason, professor of psychology here at DePaul and the director of the Center for Community Research. Dr. Jason has conducted studies around nonprofit sober living communities, particularly with a specific organization called Oxford House, and has some sharp insights about why those communities are super beneficial to people recovering from addiction. In addition to that, Dr. Jason is one of the leading experts on chronic fatigue syndrome. In 2019, Dr. Jason and his colleague, Dr. W. Lavone Robinson, were named recipients of the largest grant in the history of the university. Dr. Jason, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
You have been the director for the Center of Community Research at DePaul for over 20 years. In that time, the center has conducted research on a variety of topics, including violence prevention, substance abuse recovery, chronic fatigue syndrome, and children's consumption of media. Generally, how does the center decide on what it studies, and what types of issues tend to draw your interest?
So we are working within the framework of community psychology. And what community psychology gives a platform is for prevention rather than just treatment. How do we prevent problems from occurring before they become serious and difficult? And that's why we work with the schools on violence prevention. We also basically, in community psychology, deal with trying to help the rights of people that have been victimized, that have been traumatized. And one particular chronic illness are people who have recovered from a viral illness, but they're still very sick, just like with COVID or Epstein-Barr virus. So these are people who have what's called myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. And these particular groups have been very victimized, and we work with them as allies to basically shatter myths, to basically indicate the true prevalence rates and the true problems that they have experienced. And the third area that we work on is community building. How do we provide places where people can live, housing for people that are in desperate need of a place to be safe in. When people come out of jail and prison, their primary things they ask for are a safe place to live and a job. And those are the two things our society has difficulties providing them. Well, Oxford House Recovery Homes, there's over 3,000 of them. They serviced about 40,000 people in the last year. And these are people who often have histories of criminal justice involvement, psychiatric comorbidity, certainly substance use disorders, lots of other chronic illnesses. So they are a place that you can go into, pay your fair share, and you can spend the rest of your life there if you want. So it's stable housing for people. So we basically focus on structural issues, very similar to what sociologists do, except we're actually doing very action-oriented projects, stigma reduction for people who have been stigmatized, and also prevention. Those are the three areas that we work in, and those are three examples of the work that we do.
Awesome. So how did you get acquainted with sober living communities like Oxford House, and why did they strike you as particularly compelling subject for the potential research you conducted?
So I think we as psychologists often take things into like little pieces where we don't really look at the whole person and the needs of the whole person. And in early 1990s, I was watching 60 Minutes and I saw this group had about 200 homes at the time. And they were called Oxford Houses. And they were a place where people could live and they could take care of themselves. And there was no professional staff. And they basically just followed rules. Everyone paid their fair share. They participated in self-governance. And as long as they didn't take any alcohol or drugs, it was a safe place to live. So I said to myself, wow, this is really cool. As a community psychologist, I decided to get in touch with the people that founded the organization. And the next day after the 60-minute piece, I called Paul Malloy, who was the person who started the organization, and said, I'd be happy to work with him to help evaluate the program and understand it. And we've been collaborating for the last 30 years since then.
Wow. So could you describe for us how the model of community that Oxford House operates is different from other models of sober living communities? And what did your research find that you can tell us that the Oxford House model is more successful?
So the Oxford House model, everyone pays their fair share. There's no government subsidies or state or local subsidies. So they just rent a house. They have 7 or 8 men or 7 or 8 women. And they learn how it is to kind of figure out how to live together. And they have rules, and they give themselves instructions on how to live together. The other types of sober living houses generally have a staff. They generally have someone that owns it, and they're not completely democratically run. So I kind of felt that if the values of community psychology very much are manifested in self-run, self-help type communities. So I was very interested in studying these particular types of communities. But actually, I'm writing a grant proposal now that would compare the self-run type Oxford houses with staff-run to see if there's any differences. So that's something I hope to send the grant off so I can study that question that you've asked about.
Wow, that's exciting, and I hope you let me know how that goes.
Sure.
So I see that you have testified in the past on behalf of sober living communities that face opposition by residents of the neighborhoods that they are located within. What do you say to the people who fear that a sober living community might invite danger to their neighborhoods?
Well, we actually did a study about that a number of years ago where we looked at recovery homes in the immediate houses on that block, as well as control area. And we didn't see any differences in crime levels. If anything, these well-run houses are actually able to make sure there is no stuff going on, because most of the people in the house have had a former history of doing this type of criminal activity, and they've made a change in their life. So if anything, they'll be protective. But yes, a lot of communities say not in my backyard, don't want a house in their neighborhood, and pass up zoning laws that make it very difficult to have recovery houses there. One rule that they try to do is they say you can't have more than 5 unrelated people in a house, but a house needs to have more people to make it economically sustainable. So we've done research and actually found that higher numbers of people lead to better outcomes. And we provided that information to judges who have been ruling on cases of communities. And I might add that in every one of those cases, the Oxford House has won the judgment.
Wow. Okay. So we've talked about your work with the Oxford House. So now we want to get into CFS, which is chronic fatigue syndrome. So you have led years and years of research on chronic fatigue syndrome, right? So can you tell me how you became familiar with this subject and what sparked your interest with CFS?
So about 30 years ago, I ended up getting mono myself.
Wow.
And I had a lot of difficulties struggling with just energy and lots of symptoms. So some people, about 10% of people who get these viruses seem to have difficulties recovering. And I continued to have symptoms for many years. And I decided to look into the literature and see what was known about that. And at the time, people with this illness, it was described as kind of the yuppie flu. Those people who are white, upper middle class, tend to be women, and physicians and psychiatrists and psychologists would often sort of kind of say, well, they're just a bunch of depressed people. There's nothing really wrong with them. It's all a psychiatric condition. So as a psychologist, you can imagine, I said, this would be a ripe area to research. And I've been doing research on this for the last 30 years. What we found is that it's not a rare disorder. The CDC had suggested less than 20,000 people had this. We spent 10 years focusing on that myth and busted it, and basically did the appropriate prevalence research and found that it affects probably more like 1.5 million people in this country.
Wow.
We've done similar studies with kids now, and we're doing work now with the Prospective longitudinal study with 4,500 college students, and actually watching them before they get mono, after they get mono, and then which ones recover and which ones don't. So this is called the Prospective longitudinal study, and we're actually looking at these youth to sort of see what are the conditions they had before they got mono, which is like a trigger, so that can we identify maybe what are some maybe biological characteristics of why some people get hit with the virus and don't recover and other people do. And the same issues really apply to COVID-19 because it's also a virus, and you've probably heard about long haulers, and we're studying them now because it's the same issue. Some of them get hit by this virus, don't recover, and we need to understand why. So we're doing research right now on that as well.
Okay. So could you say that you found that CFS is often misdiagnosed and misunderstood by society? And what do you think is so difficult for society to understand about CFS?
So one of the things that people think of is it's primarily a disorder of white people. And our research suggests that that's not the case. It actually occurs in all ethnic groups. Another big myth is that it's a relatively rare disorder, and our research has suggested that's not the case. Another myth is that it's really a psychosomatic disorder, and all you have to do is get the people to exercise more, and they'll feel better. And we've done research to suggest that probably it's much more important for people to respect their energy boundaries and not push themselves so that they don't relapse. So we've done basic work on prevalence, on basic work on etiology, and basic work on treatment. And in all those areas, we have made contributions. And I might add that we at DePaul are looked at throughout the world for being some of the leaders in thought on kind of how to be an ally with patients. So we are in a very unique position that we have gotten over $14.5 million in federal grant over the last 25 years. And that means we've gotten probably about as much money as anyone in the country to study this illness. And that makes DePaul unique, special, and now provides a incredible help to all the people who have COVID, who have been trying to figure out what's going on. Well, we've been studying post-viral illnesses for decades, so we have a tremendous amount to offer to this dialogue that's occurring.
Nice. Thank you so much. So since the onset of the pandemic, you've begun research studying the relationship between long COVID and ME/CFS. What have you found so far?
Right, and thank you for saying ME/CFS. Some people just refer to it as ME. I might add that in Britain, they came up with the term ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, and it was the Centers for Disease Control that trivialized the name in 1988 and called it chronic fatigue syndrome. Well, it's not just fatigue, it's a lot more than that. And patients really dislike that name of CFS. So that's why we try to call it ME/CFS or ME.
Yes, of course.
So, yeah, I mean, I think, what we're trying to do with this area is really make a difference. We're trying to become an ally. We're trying to help patients who have been stigmatized. A lot of patients have got this illness that's very, very debilitating. And not only do they have a debilitating illness, but then they have a second trauma, which is the reaction of people to that illness. Because a lot of people with this illness are told it's not serious, or what's the big problem. So there's really very few illnesses or very few conditions that have the type of problems that patients with this illness have. And COVID-19, there's going to be the same issue. Those people who basically don't recover from COVID are going to get the same stigma, are going to get the same people questioning them. So that's why we need to learn what's happened with ME/CFS over time so that we can make sure that we can hopefully not have that happen with this new, literally millions of people who have not recovered from COVID-19.
Definitely. So overall, how has DePaul become a home for your work over the years? Is there a relationship between your personal mission and the Vincentian mission of the university that has allowed your projects to be successful?
So the Vincentian issue is really trying to make a difference, service. It's it's also teaching, and it's also research. St. Vincent de Paul, as we know, tried to make a difference in his communities based on a community psychology framework. We're trying to do the same thing. Everything we do at the psychology department and my Center for Community Research involves teaching, where we have had over 250 people over the last 20 years who have either volunteered or worked at my center who have gotten into graduate schools. So that's pretty impressive that we become, in a sense, we give them credentials so they become more competitive and they can make a difference in society. And we have people who have made a difference throughout all different areas that have had some training here. But we also do basic research to basically make life better, just as St. Vincent de Paul did, with either recovery homes for substance users, of which many of them have been homeless. Many of them have really had all types of chronic conditions. And we're working with the people who are the have-nots in our society and taking them and putting them into a middle-class lifestyle and seeing what happens. And some really magical things do happen when we give people opportunities. We're trying to break stigma, as St. Vincent de Paul did. We're also trying to work on prevention. So I think the work that we do here is very much within the spirit of the Vincentian tradition.
Awesome. Well, those are all the questions I have for you today. And thank you so much, Doctor, for being so open and thoughtful about yourself and your work. And we really appreciate it here at DePaul. And we appreciate all of the work you do and all the work you will continue to do.
Great. Thank you so much.